Hello, everybody. This is Mrs. Wilson, and today's lesson is Slavery in the Colonies and Triangular Trade. The Learn It is, I can summarize the development of triangular trade and describe ways slaves resisted forced labor in the colonies. Essential question is, why did slavery develop in the colonies? Before we get started on the presentation, we'll review some vocabulary. Slavery is the practice of owning and controlling people against their will. Slave trade is the capture, enslavement, buying, and selling of people for profit. Triangular trade route were trade routes between Africa, the Americas, and Europe in which ships carried cash crops, manufactured goods and enslaved people. And finally, uprising is a rebellion. So looking at our map of the British Empire, and we're focusing on the British Empire because the 13 colonies were part of the British Empire. Great Britain was really the last of the major European countries to get involved with exploration. They were the last, but they were, I think, by far the most successful. Looking at this map of the world in 1937, we can see just how successful the British Empire was at establishing colonies, not only in present-day United States, but on all continents around the earth. We've got Canada, Canada and North America, South America, the Bahamas, Antarctica, Africa, of course, Europe, India, Middle East, Asia, and Australia. Well, why, of course? Why in the world would Great Britain seek to establish colonies in every time zone throughout the entire world? Well, money is a big motivator. We talked about the 3 G's in the beginning of the year: God, gold, and glory. And money means power. So money is obviously a huge motivation, as well as trade, by which money will be made. Power. Money and power go hand in hand. Protection. The more colonies they have around the world, the better protected their empire is. And with that empire, of course, though, you also need to station British troops to protect your interests in all of those colonies, and that can be pretty expensive. For raw materials, I said yesterday in comparing colonies that the 13 colonies in particular, because that's what we're focusing on, provided so many raw materials for Great Britain that they were in short supply of, mainly due to overuse and population explosion as a result of the Columbian Exchange and inability to replace those resources, many of which were non-renewable. And so raw materials that can be harvested from their colonies, whether it's the 13 colonies or Australia or Africa or wherever, are going to be in high demand. And for selling goods. So not only are they going to harvest raw materials from their colonies, but they're going to take those raw materials and make them into products, manufactured products that they will sell around the world for profit. So they're going to make money on all the stuff that they make from the raw materials that they acquire from their colonies worldwide. So a map of the British Empire. By 1750, Britain held lands in North America, the West Indies, and India. So North America, of course, right here, the West Indies, and India is way over here. These places were known as colonies, and together they made up the British Empire. The colonies provided the raw materials needed to make finished products in Britain, like cotton for materials, spices for food, tobacco to smoke, and then the finished goods were sold back to the colonies at a profit. So raw materials are acquired from the colonies. They are taken to Great Britain, where they are made into products in their factory system, and then those manufactured products, let's just say clothes, for example, made out of cotton, will then be sold back to the colonies at a much higher price. Another visual, another map of the world showing the enormity of the British Empire. It was oftentimes said that the British Empire was known as the empire on which the sun never set. And by that, I think we can guess that that means that in every time zone, every 1 hour time zone, and every latitude and longitude lines across that crisscross the earth, 24 time zones around the world, that no matter where the sun is, no matter where the sun is rising or setting, at some point it is always rising or setting on some part of the British Empire. That's how vast and widespread their power and control was. So challenge question, where do you think King James I and Queen Elizabeth I got their tea, sugar, and cotton from? Well, if you said the colonies, you would be absolutely right. They had many colonies. And again, we're going to just focus on the 13 colonies, but you can see that as this map changes, early on, Great Britain had few colonies in the world, but as time marches on, their colonial empire reaches new heights. And by the early 1900s, they have certainly extended their reach of power, not only in harvesting raw materials, but in trade with other parts of the world, throughout the entire world. And you can see just how vast their empire is. Of course, the colonies are no longer part of the British Empire by the end of 1783, and that's something we'll be going into in the next unit. But you can see how big their empire is over time. All right, so the triangular trade. How exactly does this work? Well, first off, we have the North American continent to the west. We have Great Britain on the European continent to the east, West Africa, and of course the West Indies, the area that was discovered by Christopher Columbus. And this area that goes from West Africa to the colonies is called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the route taken by slaves, as you can see here on the chart. It was the most horrific part of the journey for slaves. They were packed essentially for all practical purposes, and not to be too graphic or exaggerating at all, but packed like sardines in cans, laying down on their back almost the entire voyage, crammed into just a very small space, side by side. And if you survived the passage, you were considered lucky. If you could consider becoming a slave lucky. But the Middle Passage was absolutely brutal on slaves, and the most horrific part of that entire voyage. So how exactly did this work? We'll demonstrate that through some sort of a comic or a graphic, so to speak. So a ship is bought, and the ship begins in Great Britain, in England, and it's either going to America or Africa. In this instance, the ship is not going to America, but rather to Africa. It's loaded with British things that they are short of in Africa. So whatever Africa needs, whatever supplies they need, such as guns, gunpowder, beads, copper, kettles, pans, nails, cloth, whatever they need will be loaded onto the ship. and taken to Africa, as well as plenty of beads. Well, what in the world are the beads for? Um, the beads are used for a form of currency, a form of money. So that ship from Great Britain sails to West Africa, and where slaves are auctioned off. And the question then is, how much does it cost for those slaves? Well, 100 beads. 100 beads. Okay, so that's what is going to be used for buying and purchasing these slaves. And from those beads, all sorts of intricate headwear and other items will be made. And those beads really are more like little tiny seashells. So step 4 of the triangular trade, the slaves are unload the ship and swap the goods for things that they are short of in America. So the ship is unloaded in the West Indies. It goes to the West Indies, and loaded with things that America needs. And it just so happens that America needs slaves, and lots of it. They have a very healthy, profitable plantation agriculture based on cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, corn, wheat, rice, indigo. And it's so much work that indentured servants simply aren't going to get the job done. And not only that, but indentured servants can earn their freedom after a short while. So forced labor, such as slaves, are necessary so that you don't have to keep bringing new slaves in every few years to replace the ones that would leave because they are indentured servants. So keeping slaves that you don't have to pay, that you don't have to release after 7 years, is going to be much, much more profitable in this in the triangular trade. So the ship from the West Indies goes to America, and the slaves on that ship don't think it's as good a life as those that might be actually commanding that ship and taking that ship to the Americas filled with whatever product it has, and in this case it's slaves. And certainly not a good life for the slaves once they get there. It is definitely a good life for plantation owners and for Great Britain, who will profit pretty tremendously from whatever these slaves are able to produce and harvest from the cash crops. Well, slavery in the colonies. So let's take a little bit of time to just look briefly at that. Comparing slavery in the North and the South, ways that they are like, the number of slaves in both North and South will steadily increase between 1730 and 1760. Ways that they are different, there were many, many more slaves in the South because of the plantation agriculture based on cash crop. And so slavery is going to grow much, much faster as opposed to the North, where they don't have large scale farming. They may have small farmers, and quite frankly, slavery is not profitable there, and eventually slavery will just cease to exist in the North and be focused almost entirely in the South. There were ways that the slaves could resist work once they were on plantations, and some did so by setting fire to property. They broke tools or stole food, anything that they could do to postpone working or put it off entirely. Some would run away, and that definitely did happen. And frequently, however, they were captured and punished for running away. Never killed, though, or very seldom killed, because a lot of money was spent to have slaves, or a lot of money invested in those slaves. So you wouldn't want to kill the slave, but you may want to cripple them in such a way that running away would be more difficult in the future. And some engaged in uprisings or rebellions against slave owners. It didn't happen very often, at least is not as often as you would think, given the fact that there were so many slaves in the South, huge populations of slaves. But because of the use of threat and intimidation and physical punishment against slaves, The